Senate Bill 2 by Senator King et al., an act to require that a voter provide proof of identity when voting and to provide for the issuance of a voter identification card.
The bill that I bring you is not something that's been put together hastily. It's not something that has just been thrown together. Mr. King, or Senator King, has been working on this issue since 2007. He's worked to make this bill the best possible bill that we can have for the state of Arkansas. You have debated this bill long and hard. In the Senate, it enjoyed about 2.5 hours worth of debate. It came down to the House. We debated it for about 2 hours on one day, and then the following week we debated it for another hour. Of course, this morning it was debated over in the Rules Committee, so this bill is probably one of the most thoroughly debated bills that we've discussed this session. Some of the concerns of the bill, some of the critics will state that this bill presents a poll tax. Courts in other states have looked at this and they have said that voter ID does not constitute a poll tax. Going to get an ID if you don't have an ID is no different than having to go to register to vote to begin with. That's when you drive to your county clerk's office to register to vote, that's not considered a tax. Likewise, going to their office to get an ID is also not considered a tax. There are those who say that there is no voter fraud, and because there is no voter fraud, there is no need for a bill such as this. I have with me a couple of pages here. It's about 10 pages long of all the voter fraud cases in the United States in the last 7 months. Had I printed this out for the last 2 years, it would have been a much thicker sheet of paper. And these cover all sorts of, one that I'll read you in particular. Here in Minnesota, a Cottage Grove man told police that someone had committed voter fraud by signing his name at a polling place, making it impossible for him to vote. So someone went in, signed for him, but it wasn't him. I have another case where a father and son, I guess, worked out a deal where the son went in, cast a ballot in his father's name, then the father came in a little while later and went to try to vote, and he couldn't because his son had already voted in his place, so they gave him a provisional ballot, and guess what? His vote counted twice because the son went also and voted in his name. Arkansas, of course, is not immune to voter fraud. We all are familiar with the case of Mr. Hallam. I also have documented cases here in Arkansas from, I've got 2 cases from 2006 and another case from 2003 that include voter fraud. So voter fraud does occur in the state.
Mr. Meeks, you mentioned Hudson Hallam. Now, this bill does nothing to address the problems associated with Hudson Hallam, does it?
None of the problems that he was accused of, correct.
What evidence do you have that that's occurring in school elections and these elections that you mentioned?
As far as?
Well, what evidence do you have that it is occurring now?
The voter fraud?
Voter fraud. What do you have?
I mean, I've just showed you this list here. It's got all sorts of evidence that voter fraud's occurring.
In Arkansas?
Yes, Arkansas is included in that list. As a matter of fact, we heard testimony down in the Senate where one of the, I believe it was one of the election commissioners from, I believe it was Pine Bluff, you may correct me if I'm wrong, but he said that they had a man that was trying to vote there who was, evidently he was from Texas. He had a Missouri license plate and he lived in North Carolina and he was trying to vote in Pine Bluff.
Did he get to vote?
No, because the commission.
Thank you, sir.
I really don't want to be here because I think that we are not representing the state of Arkansas well as a body when we even take up consideration of a bill which has the direct, overt intent to repress voter presentation and representation. And it is very clear that that's what this bill is all about. We are here as public representatives to try to promote the best interest of the state of Arkansas. I think everybody took an oath to do that. And when we come to this body, we interact with each other and we respect each other based upon at least one belief, and that is we all committed to the development and promotion of this state of Arkansas. And when I interact with you all, I am sincere as I speak with you, and as I share my views with you, and as I oppose and or support your bills. And I smile, and you smile, and we're all smiling faces. But smiling faces mean different things, because good faith and good intent should accompany smiling faces in this body. And I do not like to be in a situation where one of us applauds the other, and pats him or her on the back, and then at the same time takes a metal instrument and wields it in such a way as to take away a fundamental right, none of which is more important than the right to vote. I don't say that lightly, but most of you who sit here don't have my color or my history, and you've never been deprived or denied the right to vote, nor have you had to endure the hardship of an impediment to it. Remember, the 13th Amendment was about citizenship, but then we started talking about the right to vote. And even though my people couldn't vote then, that right became imbued in law. And then it took a long time for us to get it. And after then, there were, in the respective primaries, Democratic and Republican, efforts to try to repress that vote. And that there were different ways. You came up with all kinds of rules. But that was not ever done on the basis of the majority race. It was all intended initially against people of my color and against women. I noticed some of you women have signed on to this bill, but it wasn't not too long ago that you couldn't vote either. And it's only now that you're beginning to vote, and you still don't have your proper numbers in this chamber, and you don't have your proper numbers in the House nationally. You have 55% of the vote, and you have 10 to 20% of the representation. We are not a representative country. Now, under the circumstances, when you have the repression, it continues to play out so as to entrench and to keep in place those who are in place. And I say to you that this is not what Arkansas is about, as we seek to have two-party government in Arkansas. Two-party government ought to be more respectful of fundamental rights, such as the right to vote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, I debated whether I would come down after Mr. Walker's fine testimony, but I came down to share just a couple of points with you. Tell you a story about my mother. I was adopted when I was an infant at 6 weeks of age by a fine family. My mom and dad, in their late 40s, early 50s, when they adopted an infant. My mom, school teacher, first in the segregated schools of Conway County. Then after schools were integrated, she taught at North Rock Northeast at that time, now West Campus, I believe, or East Campus. My mom died in 2007 at 86 years of age, and she never drove in her life. She never had a driver's license in her life. She never failed to vote. This bill would disenfranchise her because she had no driver's license. Now, fortunately, she had me, who could take her to get this photo ID that's required to vote. But there are far too many people who are elderly, who are poor, who suffer from not driving and don't have transportation, who may have a hard time fulfilling the requirements necessary to this bill to vote, though they are registered. So I came to really speak for her from the grave to you, to encourage you to not to put this burden on people like my mom and others. It's not many people, I would grant you that. Not many people have this problem, but we ought to be encouraging voting, not discouraging voting. There are people who are in that category, and I think we ought to protect their right to vote as well. Mr. Meeks said that there's a lot of voter fraud, and I've looked at this quite a bit, and he mentioned many cases, including the case of Hudson Hallam, which, as was noted, was not voter fraud in the sense that would be impacted by voter impersonation, but absentee fraud, which this bill would have nothing at all to do with. So I researched this issue a little bit, and back during the Bush administration, there was a multi-year investigation of voter fraud in the United States of America. And after thousands of investigations and years of research, less than 24 cases nationwide of voter impersonation was found. Then I ran across a study by a very reputable foundation that looked at 2,068 reported cases of fraud between 2000 and 2012. Of those 2,068 reported cases of fraud, 10 cases involved voter impersonation. With 146 million people registered to vote, that's 1 in 15 million occurrences of possible voter impersonation. So then I say, well, what is this about? Why are we doing this, since this is really not a rampant problem? Who are we trying to impact? And so I would just look at who's less likely to have a voter ID. 18% of senior citizens nationwide are less likely to have a voter ID. 18% of young people between 18 and 24 are less likely to have a voter ID. As already been noted, those who suffer physical disabilities are less likely to have a voter ID by 10%. And then, of course, racial minorities, Asian Americans, African Americans, Latino Americans are less likely to have a voter ID. In fact, African Americans are 25% less likely to have a voter ID, like my mom, who did not have a valid government driver's license. I say voter ID, I mean a valid government driver's license. So I stand here today to speak up for my mom, who always voted, respected the right to vote, believed in our country, did not drive, did not have an ID, but wanted to vote. I ask you to vote against this bill. It is not necessary. The right to vote is more than a privilege like driving. It truly is a right that we ought to protect. Thank you.
You know, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's never really fun to go to the well to argue against people that are sincere in their beliefs as you are sincere in your beliefs. I want to speak in favor of this bill, but before I get to some of the specifics, I think we need to be especially mindful not to impugn the intent of legislation, not to assume we know what legislation is about, and to assume that elected representatives of this state come before you today to keep people from voting. It is horrifying to me that anyone in this room believes that about me or anyone else. I didn't stand before you joyfully carrying on, duty-bound carrying on the bill the controversial bill I brought to you before. But I did not accuse anyone in this body of wanting to kill babies. I didn't do that. You know I didn't. I was respectful of your beliefs. But you tell us today that we don't want people to vote, and you accuse people of my party. Our party is the party of voting rights. Our party is, and Representative Walker acknowledged this in committee, we are the party of the 15th Amendment. But we have also in the Delta been the party that hasn't been allowed in the polling places. We have had very poorly run elections in this state. And the point has often come to keep Republicans from being in the voting place, from having primaries in public buildings. I can cite the date and the time and the phone call where we were told we were not allowed to have a Republican primary. So we can argue this bill, but please don't say that we don't want people to go to vote. I will pledge to find anyone in the state. I may not personally do it, but I will find them a ride if they need a ride. If they need help tracking down a document at the Department of Vital Records, I will pledge today to help anyone who needs that help. I may not do it myself, but we will find somebody to do that. Let me say this about the proof of voter fraud. First of all, let's be clear. There's election fraud, which is a whole big topic, from counting the ballots, from tearing up ballots. And this bill isn't, and problems with absentee voting, this bill isn't going to address that. That is only going to be addressed when we get voters educated, when we get poll workers educated. But let's talk about vote fraud. Everyone says there's not much proof. If you check the law, the only time you can challenge a vote is between the time the voter calls out their name and signs their name on the voting register. That is the only time a vote can be challenged. That's about 30 seconds, maybe, in my polling place. And let me tell you something else, if you don't know, if you weren't in committee, only a poll watcher can challenge a vote. A poll worker, if they know you're not who you say, if your signature doesn't match, I contend to you there's no place in the law that poll worker can challenge your vote, that you are who you say you are. We do have instances. I think our county is pretty well run, but my county clerk came to me and said, last November, we had somebody that came to vote, and they said, you've already voted. You voted early. Well, they hadn't. They checked the signatures, checked the ID, and sure enough, somebody else had voted for him. How does that happen unless there is vote fraud? But I contend to you, we don't know how many people, and maybe it's not. Maybe it's 1%. Maybe it will never make the difference in an election. But we had better guard our ballot boxes. We want to encourage voters, but we need to guard the sanctity of the ballot box by assuring that we know the person is who they say you are. We have IDs required to stay in a shelter when it's below freezing temperatures. IDs required. Heard it on the radio. Come down to the Salvation Army. Be sure you have your ID to stay in a shelter. To go to DHS, you need your ID. To buy cigarettes, to buy alcohol, we need to get IDs out there for folks that need IDs. I think this bill helps to get those IDs in people's hands, maybe alleviating other problems they have. I ask you for a good vote on this bill. Thank you.